Hello, my name is Arthur Malman. I'm your host of this week's GGG Insights. And our guest today is Krae Van Sickle, who has been active in land preservation and energy sustainability and a member of the energy sustainability of East Hampton town. Krae has been out here for about 28 years, Krae?
Something like that.
And has been an active real estate broker, having been senior managing director at Allen Schneider, then with the Corcoran Group, and is currently with Saunders Associates. He was actively involved in getting the CPF program started, and now has focused a lot of his attention on sustainable energy. One of the things that's going on right now is probably what I'll call step 4, and that is looking at wind as a component of solving our energy problem on the East End. What we'd like to do today and a couple of our next GG Insights programs is go back to step 1 and try to understand more what the nature of our problem here is and what the various alternatives, including wind, are to solve that problem. We have been hearing about the PSE&G study, which is what we have in this chart here, which shows dramatically escalating energy use in the East End. This, by the way, is the East End. It's not Long Island. If we had a chart from PSE&G of Long Island, that chart is, interestingly enough, relatively flat. This one is escalating. Why don't you just take us through this chart, because this is what we have to start with as data, and it may not be the right data.
Sure. This is the reason why this chart is relevant is sort of it's the start of the whole process that involves the wind, and it sort of was this domino effect, has all been as a result of the LIPA and PSEG's projections for increasing peak power demand. And so peak power is different than the amount of power that we use as a community during most of the year. Peak power happens when, in July 4th, the population swells by 4 or 5 times of its normal population, and people come open up big houses, turn on their air conditioning, go to the beach with the windows open, and all of a sudden, the demand for energy spikes to sometimes 3 times as much as what it normally sort of bounces along at.
Now, the way this chart is built, Krae, what is the red? Well, first of all, this is in years, starting in 2017 and going out to 2030. What is the red and the blue and the?
It just breaks up the regions of the South Fork. The red is basically from Southampton, from the canal to Wainscott, which is where there's a big substation, and then from the substation in Wainscott to the Amagansett substation is the dark blue, and then from the Amagansett substation to Montauk is the light blue. And
so these are basically just almost internally at LIPA. They happen to be the substations.
They've just broken it up that way, but it's in general the whole thing is what's the South Fork.
Now, how do you? I know you think that this may give us an inaccurate picture of what is needed going forward. Could you just explain some of that?
Well, I just don't, they haven't shown the data. I think that maybe some people on the Southampton Sustainability Committee have foiled this to find out on what this is based.
Oh, that's Freedom of Information Act, where you're trying to get
the actual
PSE&G to turn over material.
Yeah, to see on what are they basing these projections. However, at first blush, this is such a perfect linear progression here, and it seems to be quite a lot, that it is inherently, to my mind, worthy of inquiry. Yeah.
Now, wait a minute. Let's put your broker hat on for a second, okay? You and others were very active in getting the PCF fund done, and there are various conservation groups. So much of the land out here, both here and in Southampton, is preserved. So there aren't vast tracts of land for new development.
Correct.
Obviously, people come in now and they knock down a smaller, older house
Right.
and build a bigger house.
Right.
But this seems to suggest to me, I've never really studied this chart before, a dramatically increasing residential population
Right.
when we know there isn't a dramatic amount of land available for it to increase that much. I mean, am I missing something in this chart?
I mean, listen, the dynamics that are going to affect our energy use are very complicated. I think that as you observe, they're knocking down smaller houses and building bigger houses. That's definitely true. I can say that as a broker. I would say that there also may be use patterns that are becoming more intensive. So I don't really question that it may be that there is an escalating peak power demand here. I think that this is just a starting point, but then there are other factors such as there's a great efforts towards energy efficiency. We're in the midst of a very disruptive point in history where new technologies, which I think is sort of like where the story goes down to, new technologies such as battery storage and in dropping costs of technologies of solar and so forth are going to be affecting this picture. And that also we shouldn't take it for granted that the solution to ever increasing energy is just to supply more energy. Perhaps the right perspective, and that's the utilities perspective. And of course, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Yeah. So they think, okay, if energy is going up, we just need to build more capacity and throw more energy at it.
Maybe I haven't really studied this chart. I'm just sort of looking at it with our viewers for the first time, and it seems like right now we've got this tiny energy usage, and
that's just the peak power.
There
is another graph behind this.
Okay.
So I think that we've seen this quite a bit. So we can put this there.
Okay.
We'll just put that up there. So what this is a graph of, this is a year's worth of our energy use spread out within hourly increments. Okay, and the orange part is the amount of energy that we use for each hour of the year going from January through January.
So this where this orange goes way up
is the summertime.
That's the summertime.
Exactly. And then it has laid over it the wind energy that is projected to be generated by a guy who is from the University of Amherst, I believe. And so it's just an overlay of what the wind energy and the demands for energy are on the South Fork, with these projections.
Okay, so if I look at this graph and understand it a little bit, it looks like the orange is what we use right now.
Right, correct.
And the blue is what's going to be generated if the wind farm now projected to be built operates at the most logical level.
Right, based on historical records. So what I wanted to say is that you can see these are the peaks, right? This is like probably July 4th, right? You can, if you're local, you know that's when it is. So that chart that we were just looking at starts there at that very, very high point. And what it's a graph of is if the line were to go up from there, what it's projecting is that that peak is going to keep going up. Okay, so that's what that other graph was. It's only this little point here from year to year is supposed to be going up and up and up and up, and that's what that chart that we were just looking at
But that chart went from about 2015 to 2030, more or less,
Right.
15 years.
Right.
And it started off with the peak being this big, and ended up with the peak being that big.
Right.
I mean, that just almost
Well-
mind-boggling, defies my estimation.
And I think it's completely indifferent to what's really going on in the world now, because there's basically the energy system hasn't changed for about 100 years, right? We still have the same. We have these big remote power plants that generate a bunch of energy and push it one direction down transmission lines
From a violin to the
And in this
Yeah.
case, it's from Up Island to us. And it's an extremely basic and unsophisticated system.
Yeah, but right
and we're
now,
in
though,
the
but-
middle
but
of a revolution that I would say, just as an analogy, like think about the telephone was invented around the same time that the light bulb and energy were invented, right? So what we got from a telephone was the dial tone. Right? Now what we get is we switch on the lights.
Okay.
Now look at what the smartphone does compared to what you do when you just pick up a phone and dial tone. So we've got a dial tone version of an energy system when you can see what has happened where telephony and computation and internet connectivity have gone through this explosive change. And we're on the cusp of doing that with energy, I submit, because of costs.
Well,
It's getting so economically compelling to use new technologies rather than fuels to provide for our energy needs, that we're in the midst of a process that's going to be enormously disruptive. And so that projection was completely indifferent to real world phenomena of what's going on. As
so
far as
it didn't take into effect that new devices are more energy efficient, people will use them differently. Has anybody?
I think so. I mean, again, I'm an observer. I'm not an expert. I'm looking at this, and I'm just, and I've spent obviously a lot of time paying attention to these things.
But has anybody gotten the background from PSE&G on exactly how they built the chart? Because
that's, I think, somewhat under investigation, or has been requested, and maybe the answer to that, Lynn Arthur is the one who's the one who's been investigating that. And I don't know whether she's gotten the response. But what I would also emphasize is that it's a very dynamic situation. Conditions are changing.
Yeah, but
so to make these projections without taking into consideration a lot of these changes.
I'm just trying to understand the basis of that chart that we had before with this peak going way up. Because I think we said PSE&G has another chart that shows the usage of all of Long Island as relatively flat for the.
It's because out here, little houses are getting torn down and big houses are being built, but still, it seems I'm a little incredulous that the peak demand is going to go up as much as they are projecting.
I mean, maybe a 5,000-foot house here is going to become a 10,000-foot house, but Up Island, a 1,500 square foot Levittown house is being replaced by a 3,000-foot Levittown. I mean, the dynamics don't make any sense to me of what PSE.
I mean, I think that one of the challenges is that LIPA and PSEG are not subject to some of the regulations that
disclosure
that most or many of I think that almost all of the other utilities in the United States are subject to. There's
something wrong with that picture.
That's right. The LIPA Reform Act, I think, has something to do with it. And so they're not subject to either the Public Service Commission in New York State's oversight, nor I think that maybe to some extent they're subject to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But weirdly, they operate without disclosure in many instances.
I know in the case of the wind farm, everybody's been trying to get the information, especially Rick, I guess, Drew, of what the costs are in the power purchase agreement. And even though politically it makes sense for Deepwater to make that available, given all of the hullabaloo, they can't because of LIPA being very secretive about that.
One blames it on the other, and
but this is another example where LIPA is not forthcoming. So why should we believe a chart which is just colors on a piece of paper? So let's leave that alone. We've got to come back to that in a different show, a different program. But to understand what's going on here, so this blue is the output from the wind farm if it operates in an optimal service.
I think based on conditions that are projected by this professor who studies wind at the University of Massachusetts.
And I know the Deepwater itself has actually circulated this chart.
Yes, so this is from them.
Yeah, that's right. So really, while a professor generated it, they think it's fairly accurate themselves.
One would presume.
And I guess the biggest thing we see is when the peak is up, there's more white space in the blue area.
Right.
And could you explain that a little bit to us? I mean,
Well, it's pretty intuitive that if you've lived out on the, I mean, I'm a kite surfer, so I've been paying attention to the wind change.
Otherwise you'll sink, right?
Trends for a long time. But anybody who's been out here for a while knows that the summer tends to be the doldrums in terms of when wind is blowing. And so the white is basically the gaps of when there's not much wind and the wind isn't generating much power. And the reason why I think this chart is particularly relevant is because the whole idea, this was created, the wind was brought to us because of a response to that peak power projection of going up. And deep water wind was one of the primary selections for matching, for meeting that growing projected demand in peak power, which it's clearly ill-adapted to do.
Yeah.
And
I think what's even very important, and I want to go back to it, is this is a deep water chart. So they're essentially agreeing with what you're saying, that they're not going to be able to produce that much power in the summer when we need it the most.
But I mean, there's one as background. Renewable energy, mostly, not all, but wind and solar, for instance, are intermittent sources of energy. Hydropower tends to be more consistent, but wind and solar are intermittent. And the wind blows when the wind blows, and the sun shines when the sun shines, and people need energy when people need energy. And those two events overlapping are completely a probabilistic kind of situation. So there's this intermittency gap, and that's what what I have sort of been trying to bring people's attention to, is that as part of this wind plan, which very few people have been paying attention to, they also have proposed bringing in $500 million worth of new transmission lines. And the reason why they're bringing in $500 million worth of new transmission lines, I would suggest, and this is again my observation, I'm not the expert, is because they project that peak power is going up, and that they see that the wind is not going to be able to meet that peak power demand, so they have to have another way to do it, and so they're going to bring in more power lines that enable more fossil fuel power from up island to meet the peak power demands when the wind isn't blowing.
Yeah, because we've all been hearing about the increase in the cost of our kilowatt hours of, I think it's 1 cent a kilowatt hour or something like that, based for the wind farm. But what you're saying is, hey, that's not the whole story, because obviously PSE&G is not going to give us the $500 million as a gift. They're going to charge everybody money for that peak power capacity.
Yeah, that's actually not included in the costs that have been being presented for the cost of the wind. The $500 million is sort of extra from that.
No, Craig, just to understand where you're coming from. Are you against wind energy, or?
Not at all. To the contrary.
Okay.
We all know that we need to transition to renewable energy. It's just a matter of how fast we can do it and how much damage happens to our ecology and our economy in the meantime. The projections that I have seen that show how the United States can meet its energy needs in a comprehensive way. There's one from Stanford, and then there's one from the Rocky Mountain Institute, and they both involve complete utilization of the offshore wind energy potential that the Northeast has, which is very, very abundant.
So I just want to make sure that I understand, everybody else understands. You're not saying do not build the wind farm.
Right.
You're just saying if we build the wind farm, we ain't going to get where we have to go.
Right.
There's a big piece missing, and it's this piece in the summer.
Right.
And we can either draw power.
What do we do then?
Yeah, what do we do when we're missing electricity?
Right.
We can draw power, as PSE&G is suggesting,
Right.
by massive lines coming from up island.
Right.
Or we can build big batteries here.
Right. So, well,
Let's
that
talk
gets
about
into
that.
the next level of conversation. Okay. So yes, I think that my point of view is I'm just trying to open up the conversation, right? And what I believe should be considered are non-wire alternatives
Okay.
to satisfy both the peak demand issue that we've discussed, and also when you bring in wind power at the end of the transmission lines, it now is going to be bringing in a lot of power at certain points in time. Like you can see, there are times when the blue is over the top of the orange, and then there are going to be times when the wind power is not meeting the demand. And so that to manage that intermittency, what do you do to bridge the gap of the power that we're getting from wind? And there's also two other things. They are bringing in 10 megawatts of battery storage. They're placing some of it in the floodplain in Montauk and some of it
Wait, why are they putting it in the floodplain? I mean, that sounds...
It defies reason and logic. I don't understand. We can talk about that. And then they also have a demand response program that were selected. These were the 3 programs that they selected to meet the peak power issue.
So batteries
One
are
was the wind. The other
battery-
was 10 megawatts of batteries, which is just sort of like a partial part of the solution. And the other part was 8.3 megawatts, I believe, of demand response, which is basically getting people to subscribe to a service where they get incentives to shift the time when they use their energy. Like, instead of using your pool pump in the middle of the day when everybody else is using something else, you can have your pool pump go on at night.
I think we all got something in the mail which says if you subscribe to this system,
You get a free-
PSE&G puts in a special device, and they turn
Thermostats, yes.
your air conditioning down by
Couple degrees,
2 degrees,
right.
but they only do it 6 times a year or
Right.
something like that. Okay.
Well, the thing that's also very worth noting is that these peak events only happen, I think, 16 hours a year. It's an extremely
so this
short
this is an
duration.
average for the day. This is like for the just a second in time, like a snapshot.
Those are hours. Those are each hours that you see there. They're
Okay.
broken up in hourly increments. Don't quote me on the 16
Okay.
hours, but I
Okay.
think that's what
Okay.
I've heard. But there's that's the thing is that to manage that peak power issue by spending a huge amount of money on new power lines is sort of like as a prudent capital expense to the scope of what the issue is. It doesn't seem like it's a very smart thing to do.
One of the problems I have, and I assume other people have as well, is you tell me that they're building a 10, was it megawatt?
They have 2 banks of 5 megawatt each battery banks.
Now,
Yeah.
first of all, I've got no idea how big that is. Is it as big as the room?
Well, the wind. They're like in truck trailers, and I think
okay,
there's
so-
a number
okay,
of truck trailers worth of batteries.
Okay, so they have 10 megawatts of
Battery
storage. I've got no concept what that means. We have 25,000 houses in the town of East Hampton. How, if all the power went off, how long would 10 megawatts?
I don't know the answer to that
but we ought to
question,
find
but
out,
I
yeah.
think that's the kind of question that we need to be asking. And what I'm, to sort of move the conversation along is there's an example of a peak power issue that happened in Oakland, California.
Okay.
Where they have what the typical ways that you deal with peak power in the old days or in the conventional way is either you bring in more transmission from an existing power source or from new power sources that have the capacity to deal with that peak demand, or you have these things called peaker plants, which are designed to only run very, very infrequently because peak power only happens
16
very
hours,
infrequently.
if you said. Yeah.
Right, and in Oakland it was the same thing. I think it was 35 days a year, and it was even a few hours of the day for those 35 days. And those peak power plants are very expensive and also dirty. Okay, so they had 165 megawatts worth of peak power plants. I don't know what these numbers mean, right? It was Oakland, though. It's a big place. That were getting to the end of their lives, and instead of bringing in new power lines, they came up with a solution to use battery storage and solar panels, and then efficiency measures. There's also these smart software now that sort of use these algorithms that are able to shift. As I say, instead of having everybody use the energy in the middle of the day, you can charge your cars if you've got electric vehicles at night, and you can move your pool pump, and you can run the air conditioner less and you know, the dishwasher and the laundry at night.
So what you're saying is we
they
should do
have
more
come
of
up
those.
with
Yeah, okay.
a solution there that was a non-wires alternative that actually exists now, right?
So what
and
you're-
so I'm saying
Yeah.
that we need to explore that same alternative, and it involves some level of batteries, clearly, because batteries both can absorb energy and charge when there's too much energy, like when maybe the blue is going on, and then they can discharge energy when they can do it very rapidly. It's called dispatching, you know, dispatchable power. They're very good at ramping up.
But my takeaway is the first chart we saw from PSE&G, maybe a figment of somebody's imagination. Nobody has shown
It's
any
very
data.
self-serving.
Yeah, nobody has shown any
you think about
data to us to back it up. However, this chart is based on data, and so we know this problem exists, and now the question is how
Do we
most
best address it?
rationally address it
Right.
in the most cost-effective
So there's
way.
three things that I think this
Sure.
is my supposition, is that the power lines will be really bad and a big impediment for three things that we care about a lot: clean power our clean power objectives, our desire to become resilient and self-sufficient
Yeah, we haven't
in the
discussed that.
changing
Yeah.
conditions that global warming are bringing to us, because we're in a very vulnerable place. We have acute needs for resilience and for our opportunities for local economic development, because those distributed energy resources like batteries are assets that actually come into our community, whereas power lines are something that are, you know, basically paid for and owned by investor-owned utility investors. They don't come in, they're nothing that comes
Well, I guess
to us.
part of the problem is my solar panels don't provide revenue for PSE&G. They just provide electricity for me. So PSE&G has zero interest in my solar panels and probably almost equal little interest in my batteries. But unfortunately, we've got to stop at this point.
Okay.
But this is just the tip of the iceberg. I
Great.
really think we owe it to everybody to help us understand this issue, and you'll come back and we'll continue this.
Great. I really look forward to it. I agree it's a good thing to start off with, and I look forward to talking more about it.
Thanks, Krae.